Somewhere in the world right now it is morning. Someone is drinking coffee before work. Somewhere else it is the middle of the night, and someone is watching this unable to sleep. And somewhere else entirely it is the golden hour of a Tuesday afternoon, and the light is coming through the window at just the right angle. We are scattered across every continent, every time zone, every climate, and yet here we are, connected, sharing the same ideas at the same moment across thousands of miles of ocean and land. That connection feels normal to us now. It feels like the natural state of the world. But for most of human history, it was not. For most of human history, the world was not one place. It was many places largely unaware of each other, living out entirely separate stories. And then, in a stretch of roughly 2 centuries, that changed completely. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to answer in the comments. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Because I think there is something quietly extraordinary about seeing where on earth this video reaches, and that question is going to feel a lot more meaningful by the time we get to the end of this story. Now, back to that world of separate stories. Picture the late 1400s. There are thriving civilizations in West Africa building wealth through gold and salt. There are enormous cities in the Americas, some larger than anything in Europe at the time, where sophisticated empires manage agriculture, astronomy, and trade across vast territories. There are merchant networks threading across Asia, spice routes through Southeast Asia, and Islamic scholars preserving and advancing mathematics, medicine, and geography. Europe is not the center of the world. It is one piece of a puzzle that does not yet know the other pieces exist. And then the oceans opened, what we call the Age of Exploration, roughly spanning from the early 1400s through the 1600s. Though its consequences stretch much further, is the story of how those separate worlds collided. How sailors from the western edge of Europe began pushing out into waters that no one from their civilization had navigated before, and how those voyages rewired the entire planet. Trade routes shifted. Diseases traveled. Crops crossed oceans. Empires were built. Others were destroyed. The map of the world, and the balance of power within it, was never the same again. But here is something worth keeping in mind. As we go through this story, it did not happen for one reason. There is a version of this history that reduces everything to heroic explorers with a spirit of adventure and a hunger for discovery. Brave men staring into the horizon, driven by pure curiosity. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The forces pushing European nations outward were tangled and complicated. Trade was a massive part of it. The desire to find faster, cheaper routes to the spices and silks of Asia that were making certain merchants extraordinarily rich. Religion played a role, with a genuine belief in some quarters that spreading Christianity was a moral mission. Rivalry between nations, Portugal versus Spain, later joined by England, France, and the Netherlands, created a competitive pressure where falling behind meant falling into irrelevance. Technology made new things possible. And yes, individual ambition and curiosity were real forces too. All of those things were happening at once. Unweaving them is part of what makes this history so fascinating. But there is another thread in this story that we are going to follow honestly, because to leave it out would be to tell only half of it. The Age of Exploration was also an age of conquest. For the people living in the Americas, in parts of Africa, in coastal Asia, the arrival of European ships was not a story of wonder and discovery. It was in many cases a story of violence, enslavement, and catastrophic disease. Entire civilizations that had existed for thousands of years were dismantled within decades. The scale of suffering involved is hard to comprehend, and it was not incidental to what happened. In many cases it was the point. This is a turning point in global history, arguably one of the most consequential in the last 1,000 years. The world that existed before these voyages and the world that came after them are almost unrecognizable from each other. The economic systems we live inside today, the borders that exist, the languages spoken where they are spoken, the foods people eat, the racial categories that were constructed and weaponized, so much of it has roots that trace back to this period. So this is the story we are going to tell, all of it. The navigation and the conquest, the ambition and the catastrophe, the genuine wonder and the genuine horror, the turning point and the consequences that are still, in ways both obvious and hidden, shaping the world you're sitting in right now, wherever that is, whatever time it is there. Let's start at the beginning to understand why European sailors eventually pointed their ships into the open Atlantic. You first have to understand that they were not stumbling around in ignorance. They were deeply embedded in a world that already had centuries of sophisticated, well-organized trade, and it was precisely the richness of that existing world that created the pressure to find something new. Long before anyone in Lisbon or Seville had a thought about crossing unknown waters, the connected landmass of Africa, Asia, and Europe was already threaded through with commerce. Merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, and scholars had been moving across vast distances for centuries. Ideas moved with them, crops moved with them, diseases unfortunately moved with them too. The notion that the world was fragmented and isolated before European exploration is one of the more durable myths in popular history, and it is worth dismantling right at the start. Let's begin in the Indian Ocean, because if you wanted to name one place that was the commercial engine of the pre-1400 world, that would be a strong candidate. The Indian Ocean trade network was not something that appeared suddenly. By the time European sailors were beginning to think seriously about Atlantic exploration, the Indian Ocean had been functioning as a bustling commercial highway for well over 1,000 years. Merchants from the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, the Indian subcontinent, and the coasts of East Africa and Southeast Asia had worked out the rhythms of the monsoon winds, understanding that the wind blows reliably northeast in winter and southwest in summer, and they had built entire trading civilizations around this knowledge. Timing your departure to catch the right monsoon was not a trick or an innovation by the 15th century. It was simply how things worked. It was inherited wisdom, refined across generations. The goods moving through the Indian Ocean were extraordinary in their variety. Spices, black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, travelled from the islands of Southeast Asia and the coast of India westward toward the Persian Gulf and East Africa. Cotton textiles moved in multiple directions. Gold and ivory came north from the East African coast, from great trading cities like Kilwa and Mombasa, which were cosmopolitan and wealthy places long before any European had heard of them. Chinese porcelain made its way across these routes. Silk, incense, precious stones. The Indian Ocean was not a marginal operation on the edges of world history. It was, by any reasonable measure, the most active zone of long-distance commerce on the planet. Africa itself was deeply woven into this picture, and not just on the eastern coast. In West Africa, kingdoms and empires had been accumulating wealth and political complexity for centuries. The Mali Empire, at its height in the 14th century, controlled some of the most productive gold and salt trade routes in the world. Mansa Musa, the Mali king who made a famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, reportedly brought so much gold with him that his procession through Egypt is said to have caused significant inflation in the region, though historians note some caution around the precise scale of that claim. The point is that West African rulers were plugged into transcontinental networks of exchange and diplomacy, aware of the wider world and operating as major players within it. The city of Timbuktu, often invoked today as a metaphor for a distant and forgotten place, was in reality a centre of Islamic scholarship, manuscript production and commerce that drew scholars from across the Muslim world. Then there was the Overland Silk Road, though it is worth noting that the name itself is a later invention, and the routes it describes were not a single road but a shifting network of paths across Central Asia, connecting China, Persia, the Levant, and ultimately the Mediterranean. Caravans moved across these routes carrying silk, porcelain, spices, and luxury goods eastward and westward, over enormous distances. Cities along the way, Samarkand, Bukhara, Baghdad, grew wealthy as nodes in this network. The Mongol Empire in the 13th and early 14th centuries had actually made these overland routes somewhat safer and more integrated for a period, allowing a remarkable movement of people and goods across a huge swath of Central Asia. Marco Polo's famous journey east was made possible in part by that Mongol-enforced connectivity, and while scholars debate just how accurate his accounts are, his descriptions of wealthy Asian cities left a vivid impression on European imaginations for generations. Now, where did Europe sit in all of this? Not at the centre, but not in total ignorance either. European merchants, particularly from the city-states of northern Italy, Venice, Genoa, Florence, were deeply involved in Mediterranean trade, and the Mediterranean was the western end of the larger Afro-Eurasian network. Venetian merchants were purchasing spices and silks in the markets of Alexandria and Constantinople, goods that had arrived there through Islamic intermediaries, Arab, Persian, and later Ottoman traders, who controlled the critical middle sections of the route from Asia to the Mediterranean. These intermediaries were not passive couriers. They were sophisticated merchants operating their own complex commercial networks, and they took their share of the profits at every stage. This arrangement suited the Italian city-states well enough, and they grew rich from it. But for the kingdoms of Western Europe, Portugal, Spain, France, England, the situation was more frustrating. They were several steps removed from the source. By the time a sack of pepper reached Lisbon, it had passed through multiple hands, each adding cost. The spice trade was not a minor luxury. Spices in the medieval and early modern periods served purposes we tend to underestimate today, preserving food, masking the taste of spoilage in an era without refrigeration, functioning in medicine and religious ritual. Demand was real and consistent, and the price that Western European buyers paid reflected every middleman in the long chain between an Indonesian island and a European harbour. The question that began forming in the minds of certain European rulers and merchants was not purely one of curiosity or adventure. It was an economic question with enormous stakes. Was there a way to reach the sources of these goods directly? To bypass the Islamic intermediaries and the Italian middlemen and access the wealth of Asia, the spices, the silks, the precious goods, through a route that a Western European power could control themselves? That question would eventually drive the entire age of exploration. But it is important to recognize what it tells us about the people asking it. They were not exploring blind. They were not naive about the world's shape or its riches. They had maps, incomplete, often wildly distorted by modern standards, but maps nonetheless. They had accounts from travellers. They had religious and diplomatic contacts that stretched across the known world. They knew that extraordinary wealth existed in Asia and Africa. What they lacked was a route to it that they controlled. There was also a geopolitical disruption that sharpened this desire considerably. The Ottoman Empire's conquest of Constantinople in 1453, a date that tends to stick in history students' memories, put a major node of east-west trade firmly under Ottoman control. Historians debate how dramatically this actually restricted European access to Asian goods in practice, and it is probably too simple to say it simply blocked the trade routes as commerce continued in various forms. But it did make Western European powers more acutely aware of their dependence on routes and intermediaries they did not control, and it added political urgency to the economic motivation to find alternatives. So here is the picture on the eve of the Atlantic turn. The world already had deeply entrenched, sophisticated commercial networks. The Indian Ocean was humming with activity. West African kingdoms were rich with gold. The Silk Road was a functioning, if variable, artery of exchange. Islamic merchants were the indispensable connectors of the old world's trade, and Western European kingdoms, sitting at the far western edge of this enormous network, were wealthy enough to desire more, strategically aware enough to recognize their disadvantaged position, and increasingly motivated to do something about it. What happened next was not an explosion of curiosity out of nowhere. It was the logical response, though logic is perhaps a generous word for what was also driven by ambition, rivalry, and desperation of kingdoms who understood that the existing commercial order was not structured in their favour. Portugal, sitting at the southwestern tip of Europe, with its face already turned toward the Atlantic, would be the first to seriously test what lay beyond the known edge of the map. But before we get to the Portuguese ships pushing south along the African coast, it is worth asking one more question. Why Europe? Why not the great maritime civilizations of Asia? Why not the Islamic world or the powerful African kingdoms? Why did the oceanic breakthrough that rewired the world come from the edge rather than the centre? The answer involves geography, politics, technology, and a considerable amount of contingency, and we will get into all of it next. So we left off with a question hanging in the air. Why Europe? And more specifically, why the western fringe of Europe, Portugal, Spain, rather than the great maritime powers of the Indian Ocean or the wealthy empires of Africa and Asia? Part of the answer lives in geography and technology, which we will get to. But geography alone does not move ships. What moved ships was a tangle of motives, pressures and ambitions that had been building inside European society for decades, and understanding those pressures is essential to understanding everything that followed. Start with money, because money is almost always a reasonable place to start. The economic logic was straightforward even if the execution was anything but. Spices arriving in Lisbon or Seville had travelled through at least 3 or 4 separate commercial systems before reaching a Western European market. Each transition added cost. Each intermediary extracted profit. And the rulers and merchants of the Iberian Peninsula were acutely aware of this. They were not paying for goods, they were paying for goods plus everyone else's margin. If a Portuguese merchant house could somehow reach the pepper-growing regions of the Malabar coast or the Clove Islands of Southeast Asia directly, without passing through Arab, Persian and Italian hands, the financial advantage would be staggering. This was not abstract dreaming. The wealth accumulating in Venice and Genoa was visible and infuriating proof that enormous fortunes were possible for those who controlled the flow of Eastern goods into Western markets. The ambition was not to discover something new, so much as to cut out everyone standing between Western Europe and the sources of existing wealth. Gold was a separate but equally powerful draw. West Africa had been producing gold that filtered north across the Sahara for centuries, enriching North African and eventually Mediterranean merchants along the way. European rulers knew the gold was there. The rumours and the occasional physical reality of West African gold made that clear enough. What they did not know was how to reach it without crossing through Islamic-controlled North Africa. The Atlantic coast offered a potential alternative route, and this possibility was very much on the minds of Portuguese planners from early in the 15th century. Gold meant coinage. Coinage meant the capacity to pay armies, build navies, fund courts, and project power. In a period of fierce competition among emerging European states, access to gold was not merely a commercial advantage, it was a strategic one. Religion wove through all of this in ways that are genuinely difficult to separate from the material motives, because the people involved did not draw that separation themselves. Medieval and early modern European Christianity carried a strong strand of what you might call crusading energy, the idea that spreading the faith and defeating its enemies was not just a pious aspiration, but an obligation of Christian rulers. The Crusades themselves had largely failed to achieve their stated objectives, but they had not extinguished the impulse. Portuguese and Spanish expansion in the 15th century was framed, at least in part, as a continuation of the struggle against Islam, an attempt to outflank the Islamic world by reaching behind it, to make contact with Christian populations rumoured to exist in Africa and Asia, and to bring new peoples within the orbit of the Church. The legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John, a wealthy, powerful Christian ruler somewhere in Africa or Asia, whose alliance could theoretically change the balance against Islam, was a persistent and motivating myth. Historians debate how literally various explorers and monarchs believed in Prester John, but the idea clearly shaped how they imagined what they might find. The possibility of Christian allies waiting somewhere beyond the Islamic world was a genuinely galvanizing fantasy. The political dimension deserves its own attention. By the 15th century, the kingdoms of Western Europe were not the fragmented, locally focused entities of the early medieval period. They were consolidating, developing centralized bureaucracies, professional armies, more sophisticated systems of taxation and administration. Portugal had finished its internal reconquest of Moorish territory by the mid-13th century, earlier than Spain, which gave it a head start in redirecting martial energy outward. Spain completed its own reconquest in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, which was not a coincidence in terms of political mood and available resources. These were states that had been organized for centuries around the idea of military expansion in a religious cause, and once that cause was completed at home, the energy needed somewhere to go. Maritime exploration offered a direction. More critically, the competition among European states meant that any kingdom that established oceanic trade routes gained advantages over its rivals. The race was not just against the Islamic world or the Ottomans, it was against each other. If Portugal reached India first, Spain was at a disadvantage. If Spain claimed Atlantic islands, Portugal needed to respond. This competitive dynamic accelerated decision-making and risk-taking in ways that a single dominant power might not have felt. Then there were demographic and social pressures that rarely get enough attention. The 15th century in Europe was still working through the long aftermath of the Black Death, which had killed perhaps a third of the population a century earlier. Social structures had shifted, labour had become more valuable, but so had ambition. Younger sons of noble families, minor knights, merchants without inherited wealth, soldiers who had finished fighting in the Reconquest, all of these people existed in a society where opportunity at home was limited and competition for status was fierce. Overseas ventures offered something that European society could not easily provide: the chance to acquire land, wealth, and title through individual action. The conquistadors who would later carve through the Americas were not primarily royal agents carrying out a master plan. They were often desperate and ambitious men gambling that the rewards abroad would exceed anything available to them at home. The social pressure cooker of late medieval Europe produced people who were willing to take extraordinary risks, precisely because the alternatives were so uninspiring. And underneath all of these concrete motivations ran something harder to categorize: the shaping power of myth, rumour, and wildly imperfect geography. European maps of the period were not blank in the unknown spaces. They were filled in with speculation, travellers' tales, ancient authorities, and outright invention. Islands in the Atlantic had been marked on Portuguese and Spanish charts for decades before anyone confirmed they existed. The exact size of the ocean was contested, with some influential calculations suggesting Asia was far closer than it actually is, a misunderstanding that Columbus famously and consequentially took very seriously. The wealth of the East had been described by Marco Polo and others in terms that seemed almost fantastical, which paradoxically made the goal feel both enormously attractive and achievable enough to attempt. People were not sailing into a void, they were sailing toward a destination they believed they understood, shaped by a geography that was partly real, partly ancient theory, and partly the accumulated wishful thinking of generations. All of these forces, economic hunger, religious ambition, political competition, social pressure, and the seductive half-knowledge of imperfect maps, were converging on the same moment. What was needed now was the practical capacity to act on them. And that capacity came from a revolution in ships, navigation and cartography that made the Atlantic crossable in a way it had never quite been before. That last phrase is worth holding on to, the practical capacity to act, because desire alone, no matter how intense, does not cross an ocean. What actually sent ships into open water and brought some of them back was a collection of technologies, techniques, and borrowed knowledge that accumulated slowly and then in the 15th century started working together in surprisingly powerful ways. Begin with the ships themselves, because nothing else matters if the vessel falls apart in heavy seas or cannot point in the direction you need to go. The workhorse of Iberian exploration was the caravel. and it is hard to overstate how much this relatively small ship changed what was possible. Caravels were not large. They typically ran somewhere between 50 and 150 tons, which is modest by almost any standard, but they had qualities that made them exceptional for exploratory work. They were fast, they were maneuverable, and crucially, they could sail much closer to the direction the wind was coming from than earlier ship designs could manage. This last quality, which sailors call sailing to windward, sounds technical but has enormous practical consequences. If you can only sail with the wind pushing you from behind, you are essentially a prisoner of whatever direction the wind happens to blow. A ship that can angle against the wind, tacking back and forth to make progress upwind, has options. It can go places, and more importantly, it can come back. The key to this maneuverability was the rigging. Earlier Mediterranean vessels relied heavily on lateen sails, triangular sails mounted on angled yards that were already well suited to sailing across or into the wind. Northern European ships favoured large square sails that caught following winds efficiently, but struggled with anything else. The caravel often combined both systems, using square sails on the forward masts to harness strong following winds in open ocean runs, and lateen sails on the rear masts for the careful manoeuvring needed in coastal work or against the wind. This hybrid approach was not an accident. It was the product of Mediterranean and Atlantic shipbuilding traditions meeting on the Iberian Peninsula, where Portuguese and Spanish builders could observe and borrow from both. The result was a vessel that could adapt to conditions rather than being defeated by them. Navigation presented a different kind of challenge, and the tools available to 15th century sailors are worth understanding on their own terms rather than simply noting what was missing. The magnetic compass had reached Europe from China via the Islamic world by the 12th century, and by the 1400s it was a standard fixture on any serious ocean-going vessel. What the compass provided was direction, a constant, reliable reference that did not depend on seeing the sun or stars. This mattered enormously in overcast conditions, in fog, at night. It told you which way you were pointed. What it did not tell you was where you were. For position, navigators relied on a combination of instruments and techniques. The astrolabe, again an instrument with deep roots in Islamic astronomical tradition, allowed a navigator to measure the angle of the sun or a known star above the horizon. From that angle, with the right tables, you could calculate your latitude, your position north or south of the equator. This was genuinely useful information, and experienced navigators could determine their latitude with reasonable accuracy on a calm day with a steady hand. The cross-staff, a simpler instrument, served a similar purpose and was in many ways easier to use at sea. What neither instrument could tell you was your longitude, your position east or west. That problem would not be reliably solved until the 18th century, which means that for the entire age of exploration, every navigator was working with an incomplete picture of where they actually were. To fill that gap, navigators used dead reckoning, a method that is both ingenious and genuinely nerve-wracking to think about. Dead reckoning meant keeping a continuous running estimate of your position based on your last known location, your compass heading, your estimated speed, and the time elapsed. Speed was often measured by throwing a log overboard and counting how long it took the ship to pass it, or using a knotted rope to measure drag. Every estimate compounded the last one, and every small error in speed or direction accumulated over days and weeks into potentially large positional errors. Skilled navigators were very good at this. Experience, attention, and a feel for the sea could produce reasonable results over short distances. Over the open Atlantic, the margin for error was significant. Portolan charts, the detailed navigational maps that Mediterranean sailors had been developing since at least the 13th century, captured coastal outlines and compass bearings with impressive accuracy for the waters that had actually been sailed and recorded. They were working tools covered in compass roses and rhumb lines, designed not to be aesthetically beautiful, but to answer practical questions about how to get from one port to another without running aground. As Portuguese explorers worked their way down the African coast, they extended these charts incrementally, each voyage adding new detail to the edges of the known. The charts were valuable precisely because they encoded hard-won experience, but they also embedded errors that could persist for generations, and for regions beyond the charted world, they offered nothing at all. The knowledge flowing into Iberian navigation from other traditions deserves genuine acknowledgments. Arab astronomers and geographers had preserved an extended Greek understanding of the heavens and the shape of the earth, producing astronomical tables that European navigators depended on for celestial calculations. The compass came from China. The lateen sail had deep roots in the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea, where mariners had been making long open water crossings for centuries before any Portuguese ship rounded Cape Verde. When historians talk about the age of exploration as a European achievement, it is accurate in the sense of agency and consequence, but the technical toolkit was assembled from contributions that stretched across the known world. One of the most consequential pieces of practical knowledge was the wind system itself. The Atlantic is not a uniform mass of air, it has patterns, the northeast trade winds that blow steadily toward the southwest below the tropics, the westerlies that push back toward Europe at higher latitudes. Once Portuguese sailors understood that these patterns existed and could be predicted, the ocean became something you could plan around rather than simply endure. The concept of the volta do mar, swinging out into the open Atlantic to catch favourable winds rather than fighting up the coast, represented a fundamental shift in how sailors thought about ocean passages. Going out to sea to make progress was counterintuitive enough that it took time to become standard practice, but it transformed what was achievable. Even with all of this, the limits were real. Longitude remained unknown. Storms were unpredictable. Charts ended where experience ended. Scurvy and disease killed crews that the weather spared. Every voyage beyond the charted world was a bet made with incomplete information, and the sailors and captains who took those bets knew it. The technology had improved enough to make success possible. It had not improved enough to make success certain. So who first put those ships and tools to serious, sustained use in the Atlantic? The answer, in the 15th century, is Portugal, a small kingdom on the far western edge of Europe that, for a combination of reasons that were partly strategic, partly commercial, and partly accidental, ended up leading the first systematic push into unknown ocean waters. Portugal had certain natural advantages. Its coastline faced the Atlantic directly, and its ports sat closer to the African coast than those of any other European power. Its sailors had long experience in Atlantic fishing and coastal trade, which meant a culture of seamanship already existed before any organized program of exploration began. The kingdom had also just finished consolidating itself after the long contest with Castile, and had energy and ambition to direct outward rather than inward. None of these factors alone explains what happened next, but together they made Portugal a plausible candidate to go first. This is where Prince Henry enters the story, and it is worth being careful here, because the version of Henry that appears in older histories is often more legend than history. The figure sometimes called Henry the Navigator, the brilliant visionary running a school of navigation at Sagres and masterminding Portugal's oceanic expansion, is a largely romantic construction. Henry did exist, and he did matter. He held the governorship of the Algarve, the southernmost province of Portugal, which gave him both wealth and political leverage. He was deeply interested in Atlantic ventures and sponsored a number of expeditions along the African coast. He almost certainly supported the accumulation of geographical knowledge and the recruitment of experienced mariners. But he was not a sailor himself. He did not single-handedly direct Portuguese expansion, and the romantic image of Sagres as a proto-scientific research institute is almost certainly exaggerated. What actually drove Portuguese expansion was messier and more interesting than any single visionary. Merchants wanted profit. The Portuguese crown wanted revenue and strategic advantage. Military religious orders, of which Henry was a leading figure, wanted crusading opportunities against Muslim powers in Africa. Individual captains and pilots wanted fame, reward, and the particular kind of status that came from having sailed somewhere no one from your world had sailed before. These motivations pulled in somewhat different directions and sometimes conflicted, but they also reinforced each other in ways that kept the enterprise moving even when individual voyages disappointed. The early push was not purely into open ocean. It began incrementally with the Canary Islands, and then the island groups that would become some of Portugal's most valuable early possessions. Madeira, uninhabited when Portuguese sailors reached it in the early 1420s, was transformed within decades into a significant agricultural colony. The key was sugar. Madeira's climate turned out to be exceptionally suited to sugarcane cultivation, and Portuguese colonizers brought the plant from the Mediterranean, along with settlers and, critically, labour. By the middle of the 15th century, Madeira was producing sugar in quantities that made it economically important, not just a way station but a destination generating real wealth. This was a template that would be repeated, with terrible consequences across the Atlantic world in the centuries to come. The Azores, discovered or rediscovered sometime around 1427, were further out in the Atlantic, roughly a third of the way to North America, though no one yet knew that. They were less immediately productive than Madeira, but strategically important as a provisioning stop and as evidence that islands could be found and settled even deep in open ocean. The Azores also helped Portuguese sailors learn the wind patterns of the mid-Atlantic, including the westerlies that would eventually make return voyages from the far west possible. Each island group, in other words, was not just an economic asset, but a lesson. Down the African coast, the voyages proceeded in fits and starts, rather than in a clean progressive line. Each expedition extended knowledge of the coastline a little further south, adding detail to the charts, identifying anchorages, locating sources of fresh water. Cape Bochador, a relatively modest promontory on the West African coast just south of the Canaries, acquired an outsized reputation as a barrier that Portuguese sailors were reluctant to pass. The accounts of currents and shallow waters may have been somewhat exaggerated, but the psychological weight of the unknown was real. When Gil Yanes finally rounded it in 1434, the event was celebrated, partly because it broke a mental barrier as much as a physical one. Beyond Bojador, the coast opened onto sub-Saharan West Africa, and the character of the voyages began to shift. Commerce became increasingly central. Portuguese sailors found that West African rulers and merchants were interested in trade, and that gold was available, gold from the interior networks that had long fed the trans-Saharan trade routes, now accessible from the sea. This was significant. The gold trade across the Sahara had enriched North African and eventually Mediterranean economies for centuries, and the Portuguese were now positioning themselves to tap some of that wealth through a completely different route. But these same coastal voyages carried something far darker from nearly the beginning. Raiding for captives began early as the 1440s. Portuguese expeditions were seizing people from the African coast and bringing them back to Portugal. The line between trade and raiding was blurry and sometimes crossed deliberately. Some early Portuguese accounts treat these raids in the language of crusade and conversion, framing the capture of Africans as an act of Christian charity that would save souls. These justifications were self-serving and recognized as such even by some contemporaries, but they proved durable because they were useful. By 1444, a public auction of enslaved Africans was held in Lagos in southern Portugal, an event recorded by a Portuguese chronicler who noted the distress of the captives with what seems like genuine discomfort, while still framing the whole enterprise as ultimately beneficial. The institution of Atlantic slavery did not spring fully formed from a single moment, but the patterns being laid down in the 1440s and 1450s, the raiding, the transport, the commodification of human beings across ocean water, were the direct predecessors of the system that would eventually consume millions of lives. Exploration and slavery were intertwined from the very beginning of Portugal's Atlantic project, and any account that separates them does a disservice to both history and to the people who suffered. What Portugal was building, voyage by voyage and island by island, was not just geographical knowledge but an entire infrastructure of oceanic expansion. Trading posts, colonized islands, accumulated sailing experience, and the brutal labor systems that would make the whole enterprise profitable. By the time the generation after Henry was pushing down toward the equator and beyond, the question was no longer whether the Atlantic could be crossed or the African coast fully explored, but only when. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships had pushed far enough down the African coast that the continent's ultimate shape was becoming a genuine question. Everyone who thought seriously about it understood that if Africa had a southern tip, and the ancient geographical writings suggested it might, then a sea route to the Indian Ocean was at least theoretically possible. The prize, if that route existed, would be staggering. Direct access to the spice trade, bypassing the Ottoman-controlled land routes, and the Venetian and Egyptian middlemen who collected tolls at every step. The question was whether anyone could actually find the end of Africa and survive long enough to report back. Bartholomew Dias provided the answer in 1488, and the story of his voyage is one of the most consequential in the history of navigation. Dias sailed south with a small fleet, and somewhere off the southern African coast encountered storms severe enough to push his ships well away from land. When the weather finally broke and he turned east expecting to find the coast, there was nothing because he had already rounded it without realizing. He turned north, and the coastline he found was running northeast. Africa was behind him. He had passed the bottom of the continent. Dias went a little further along the coast. He now understood to be the eastern side of Africa before his crew, exhausted and frightened, refused to continue. He turned back, and on the return journey he saw the Cape itself, the rocky storm-battered headland that separated two oceans. He named it the Cape of Storms, which was honest and accurate. The Portuguese king João II reportedly renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, which was strategic and optimistic. Whether that story is strictly true or somewhat embellished in the telling is hard to say with certainty, but the symbolism is exactly right. The name was about what the Cape promised, not what it delivered. What it promised was the route to India. The Cape of Good Hope mattered not as a destination, but as a passage proof that ships could move from the Atlantic into the Indian Ocean without crossing land. Strategically, this meant Portugal could theoretically outflank every existing trade network, connecting Asia to Europe. Commercially, it meant that spices, silks, and other luxury goods could, in theory, arrive in Lisbon without passing through the hands of competitors who demanded a share at each transfer point. This was not a marginal advantage. It was potentially transformative, and the Portuguese crown understood it immediately. It took nearly a decade, for reasons that remain somewhat debated, political complications, other priorities, the sheer cost of organizing a major expedition, before the follow-up voyage actually departed. When it did, in 1497, the commander was Vasco da Gama, a nobleman with a reputation for toughness and determination who had been selected, possibly over other candidates, to make the crossing to India that Dias had proven was reachable. Da Gama's fleet rounded the Cape, worked its way up the eastern African coast, and eventually crossed the Indian Ocean with the help of a pilot, possibly an experienced Arab or Indian navigator, though the exact identity has been argued over by historians for centuries, who knew the monsoon winds that made that crossing possible. When Da Gama arrived at Calicut on the southwestern coast of India in 1498, he encountered something that probably surprised him more than the ocean crossing itself, a world that did not need him. The Indian Ocean had supported one of the most sophisticated and extensive trading systems on Earth for centuries before any European ship entered it. Arab, Indian, Malay, Chinese, and East African merchants moved goods across those waters with a regularity and efficiency that the Portuguese had not imagined from the outside. Calicut itself was a cosmopolitan port city where merchants from dozens of different cultures conducted business in multiple languages, governed by relationships, credit networks, and reputations that had been built over generations. Da Gama arrived with trade goods suited to Mediterranean markets: cloth, coral, sugar, that the merchants of Calicut found unimpressive to the point of insult. The local ruler, the Zamorin, was polite but unenthusiastic. The Muslim merchants who dominated much of Calicut's trade were actively hostile, recognizing immediately that Portuguese competition would threaten their position. Da Gama managed to load some spices and depart, but the first voyage was commercially thin. The Portuguese had reached India, which was a genuine achievement. What they had not done was establish themselves as serious players in the trade that was already running perfectly well without them. This is a point worth dwelling on, because it corrects a persistent distortion in how the age of exploration is sometimes told. Portuguese ships did not bring commerce to the Indian Ocean. They did not open a previously closed world to trade. They arrived at a party that had been going for centuries and inserted themselves at first awkwardly, and then increasingly by force. Force is the key word. When diplomacy and attractive trade goods failed, Portuguese commanders found that their ships carried something the Indian Ocean had not seen in quite the same form: heavy naval artillery capable of devastating any wooden vessel that came within range. Da Gama's second voyage in 1502 was explicit about what Portuguese strategy would become. He intercepted a ship returning from Mecca carrying hundreds of pilgrims, locked them below decks, and burned the ship. The massacre was deliberate, and its message was deliberate. The Portuguese intended to control access to these waters, and those who did not accommodate them would be destroyed. What followed over the next few decades was the construction of what the Portuguese called the Estado da India, literally the State of India, a network of forts, trading posts, and naval stations strung across the Indian Ocean from East Africa to the Malay Peninsula. It was not a territorial empire in the later colonial sense. The Portuguese lacked the manpower to conquer and administer large land areas. Instead, they aimed to control the sea lanes themselves, demanding that ships purchase licenses to sail and attacking those that refused. The system was enforced through a combination of violence, the threat of violence, and occasionally genuine diplomacy with rulers who found Portuguese alliance useful against their own enemies. The Estado da India was always more fragile than it appeared from the outside, and its dominance was never as complete as Portuguese officials claimed. Existing trade networks bent around it, went underground, found other routes. Local rulers who cooperated sometimes played the Portuguese against other rivals. Arab and Indian merchants adapted. The Indian Ocean system was resilient enough that it absorbed this violent intrusion without collapsing, though it was significantly disrupted. What Portugal had demonstrated, however, was something the rest of Europe was watching closely: that a relatively small state with good ships, determined commanders, and a willingness to use overwhelming violence at sea could insert itself into the richest trading system in the world and extract wealth from it. Whether that model was admirable or appalling, and opinions differ, then as now, it was clearly effective enough to inspire imitation. And while Da Gama was still fighting his way into the Indian Ocean trade, another voyage had already departed in a completely different direction, with consequences no one on earth had anticipated. That other voyage had begun not in Lisbon but in Palos, a small Spanish port, and it sailed not east but west, driven by a proposal that most informed Europeans considered geographically dubious, commercially speculative, and probably not worth the money. Christopher Columbus had been trying to sell his idea for years before Spain agreed to back him. The core of the proposal was straightforward: sail west across the Atlantic and reach Asia from the other direction. This was not, as is sometimes claimed, a radical challenge to flat earth thinking. Educated Europeans had known the earth was spherical since antiquity, and that was not the controversy. The controversy was about size. Columbus believed the ocean between Europe and Asia was narrow enough to cross in a reasonable voyage with the provisions a fleet could carry. His calculation put the circumference of the earth significantly smaller than it actually is, and placed Asia much further east than it actually extends. Essentially, he was wrong about the numbers in almost every important way. The scholars and advisers who rejected his proposal in Portugal and in Castile were not being hidebound or unimaginative. In many cases, they were being accurate. The consensus among knowledgeable geographers was that the ocean was far too wide for the voyage Columbus was describing. They were right. Columbus simply had the luck, or the misfortune, depending on how you measure it, of being wrong in a way that happened to collide with something that was actually there. Spain's decision to back him in 1492 was shaped by a specific moment of opportunity. Portugal had just demonstrated with Dias's rounding of the Cape that the eastern route to Asia was real and would soon be developed. If Spain wanted any piece of the spice trade or anything comparable, it needed a different approach. Columbus offered one. The costs of the expedition were relatively modest compared to major military campaigns, and the potential upside, if he was right, was enormous. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had just completed the Reconquista with the fall of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, and they were in a position to think about expansion. The timing aligned. The gamble was authorized. Columbus departed in August 1492 with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and roughly 90 men. The outward crossing was not as harrowing as it is sometimes dramatized. The trade winds that Columbus caught in the lower Atlantic pushed his fleet reliably westward, and the voyage from the Canary Islands to first landfall took about 5 weeks. The crew had anxieties, certainly, and the logs suggest tension when land did not appear as quickly as Columbus had predicted, but there was no serious mutiny. On October 12th, a lookout on the Pinta spotted land. Where exactly Columbus first touched land in 1492 has been disputed by historians for centuries, and the precise island, somewhere in the Bahamas, has not been definitively established to everyone's satisfaction. Columbus called it San Salvador and claimed it for Spain. The people he met there, whom he called Indians on the immediate assumption that he was near the Indies of Asia, were almost certainly Lucayan Taino, part of a broader Taino culture that extended across the Caribbean islands. Columbus described them in his journal as peaceful, beautiful, and, in a passage that reveals his priorities almost immediately, as people who would make good servants and could easily be converted to Christianity. The extraction of value and the extension of Spanish authority were in his thinking from the first day. He spent several months exploring the Caribbean, moving through the Bahamas, the northern coast of Cuba, and the island he called Hispaniola, present-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, before returning to Spain. He brought back a handful of indigenous people, parrots, gold ornaments, and plants. What he brought back in terms of material wealth was modest. What he brought back in terms of political impact was enormous. Throughout his life, and this is one of the stranger threads in the story, Columbus maintained that he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. He called the people he met Indians, and he died in 1506 apparently still holding to the interpretation that the Caribbean was the outer edge of the Asian world, or at least publicly refusing to contradict it. Whether he genuinely believed this, or whether he was protecting his own claims and titles under the agreements he had negotiated with the Spanish crown, is something historians continue to debate. The agreements had given him a share of profits from any territories he found. Admitting he had found something entirely unknown, rather than the route to Asia, might have complicated those arrangements. The gap between what Columbus expected and what he had actually found was enormous, and it would take years for Europeans to fully grasp it. The Caribbean islands were not the Spice Islands of the Indies. The people living there were not the subjects of the Great Khan or the trading partners of the ports Marco Polo had described. The gold was real, but limited. There were no immediately obvious routes to the silk and pepper markets that had motivated European oceanic expansion in the first place. The lands Columbus had found were, by any measure, something Europe had no framework for, a hemisphere of interconnected civilizations, ecosystems, and peoples whose existence had been entirely outside the European, Asian, and African worlds that had known each other, however, indirectly, for centuries. The immediate effect of Columbus's return was a flurry of activity. Spain moved quickly to establish its claim, and within a year the Treaty of Tordesillas had divided the yet-to-be fully explored Atlantic world between Spain and Portugal, along a line drawn through the ocean, an agreement we will come back to, because its consequences stretched far beyond what either power could have imagined in 1494. More fundamentally, the 1492 voyage broke something open. Columbus had not found a route to Asia, but he had demonstrated that large inhabited land existed in the Atlantic, and that ships could reach it, survive and return. Subsequent voyages followed almost immediately, and they began filling in what Columbus had left unknown. Within a decade it would become increasingly difficult, though not yet impossible for everyone, to maintain the interpretation that this was the edge of Asia. The scale and character of what lay to the west was starting to become apparent, and it pointed not toward the known world but toward something that would require entirely new maps, entirely new categories, and an entirely new vocabulary to describe. What happened next in those lands was shaped heavily by what Europe brought with it, and what it intended to take. When Columbus returned to Spain in 1493, the political machinery of two rival empires moved very quickly. Spain and Portugal had been circling each other as competitors for Atlantic expansion for decades, and the prospect of Columbus having found something, whatever it was, meant that the question of who owned what could not be left to drift. Within months, Pope Alexander VI issued a series of papal bulls that attempted to draw a clear line. The most consequential divided the Atlantic world along a meridian, granting Spain rights to territories to the west and Portugal rights to territories to the east. Portugal's King João II objected immediately. The Pope's initial line was drawn too far east to suit him, and the two kingdoms went directly into negotiation. What emerged in June 1494 was the Treaty of Tordesillas, which shifted the dividing line roughly 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Anything found east of that line would belong to Portugal. Anything found west of it would belong to Spain. The agreement was signed and ratified. The Pope gave his approval, and that, officially, was how two kingdoms sitting on the western edge of Europe divided the rest of the planet between themselves. The papacy's involvement here is worth pausing on. Papal authority in this period was not purely spiritual. It carried real political weight, particularly over Catholic crowns whose legitimacy was partly grounded in church sanction. The specific legal framework drew on a tradition called the doctrine of discovery, which held that Christian monarchs could claim sovereignty over lands not already ruled by other Christian rulers. The Church's role was to authorize that process, and Alexander VI, a Spaniard himself, which did not go unnoticed by the Portuguese, obliged. The logic was that infidel lands, or lands inhabited by non-Christians, could be claimed and possessed in the name of Christian civilization and for the purpose of evangelization. The spread of Christianity was, in this framing, not just an incidental goal, but the fundamental justification that made the whole enterprise legally coherent. This is where the legal reasoning starts to reveal its own hollowness, though it is worth taking the arguments seriously enough to understand how they were actually made at the time, rather than dismissing them as obvious cynicism. The people drawing these lines and writing these doctrines genuinely believed, or at least operated within a worldview that made it possible to believe, that they were bringing something of value, salvation, civilization, order, to people who lacked it. The language of Christian duty and universal sovereignty was not simply a cover story invented to disguise greed. It was a theological and juridical tradition that had been developing for centuries, and it gave European expansion a self-conception that was morally coherent from the inside. But it was also, from the outside, and frankly from any serious examination even at the time, a framework that conveniently arrived at the same conclusion no matter the specifics of the situation. The lands and the people already there had fewer rights than the arriving Europeans, and the arriving Europeans were authorized to take possession. Whether the people already living in those lands recognized any of this, which they did not, because they had no knowledge of papal bulls or Castilian treaties, was not a question that much troubled the legal architecture. The full absurdity of the situation was revealed quite quickly. When the line was drawn at Tordesillas, neither Spain nor Portugal had any reliable idea what lay in the enormous territories they were dividing. The Americas were not mapped. The Pacific did not yet exist in European knowledge as a discrete ocean. The entire Eastern Hemisphere's coastlines were only partially understood. The two powers were essentially dividing a world they could not see, using a line drawn across an ocean, negotiated in a town in northwest Castile, to govern territories they had never visited, and peoples they had never met. Imperial ambition had lapped geography by several lengths. The practical consequences of this became visible within a few years, and they came through an accident, or what may have been an accident. In 1500, a Portuguese fleet under Pedro Álvares Cabral set out for India following the route that Vasco da Gama had pioneered around Africa, sailing far to the southwest to avoid the doldrums, a manoeuvre that had become standard navigational practice. Cabral's fleet made landfall on a coast that was definitively not Africa. It was, as subsequent exploration would confirm, the eastward bulging coast of South America. Whether Cabral's arrival in what would become Brazil was a genuine discovery, or a deliberate survey mission that Portugal had reason to expect might find something, there is a question. Historians have argued about for a long time without reaching consensus. There is some evidence that Portuguese navigators may have sighted or even touched South American coast before Cabral, possibly during exploratory sweeps that were never fully documented. What is clear is that Cabral claimed the land for Portugal, reported back to Lisbon, and Portugal moved to assert its rights under the Treaty of Tordesillas, which conveniently placed the Brazilian coast east of the dividing line, within Portugal's zone. Whether by design or by fortune, Portugal had its foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The Brazilian case illustrates something important about how the whole system worked, or rather how it often did not work as neatly as the treaties implied. The line at Tordesillas was drawn with profound ignorance of what lay on either side of it, and as more of the actual geography became known, the line's relationship to reality grew increasingly strained. Spain and Portugal would spend decades arguing about where exactly various territories fell, and other European powers, France, England, the Netherlands, would eventually dismiss the treaty entirely on the grounds that they had never agreed to it. The French crown's response, attributed to King Francis I, was something to the effect of wishing to see the clause in Adam's will that divided the world between Spain and Portugal. The arrangement that looked like a settlement in 1494 was, in the longer run, more of an opening bid. What it was not at any point was an arrangement that involved any consultation with the millions of people already living in the lands being divided. From the perspective of the Taíno fishing on Hispaniola, or the Tupinam bar communities on the coast of what Cabral had just renamed Vera Cruz, or the vast populations of the interior of the Americas who had not yet seen a European ship, the Treaty of Tordesillas was a document that did not exist. It was drawn in a world they were not part of, in a legal and theological tradition they had never encountered, by rulers whose authority they had no reason to recognize. The claims made on paper in Spain and Portugal in 1494 meant nothing yet in the places they claimed. What would make them mean something? What would impose European sovereignty on the ground, rather than just in ink, was violence, disease, and the systematic dismantling of the worlds that already existed there. That process was already beginning. The process of making those paper claims real on the ground was neither quick nor inevitable, and it did not look like a foregone conclusion to anyone living through it. What happened in the Americas in the first half of the 16th century was not a clean military sweep by an unstoppable civilization. It was contingent, violent, opportunistic, and in many ways astonishing even to the people doing it. Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast of Mexico in 1519 with roughly 500 soldiers, a small number of horses, and no authorization from the Spanish governor of Cuba, who had actually tried to cancel the expedition. What he found was a continent that was not waiting passively to be conquered. The Aztec Empire, more accurately called the Mexica Triple Alliance, controlled central Mexico from the city of Tenochtitlan an island metropolis in a lake that contemporary Spanish observers described with something close to awe. It was larger than most European cities of the time, architecturally sophisticated, and at the centre of a tributary system that extracted wealth and labour from a wide surrounding region. It was also crucially despised by many of the peoples it had subjugated. This is the part of the story that often gets lost when the conquest is told as a simple narrative of European triumph. Cortés did not defeat the Aztecs. He and a relatively small Spanish force allied with tens of thousands of indigenous warriors, Tlaxcalans and others who had their own reasons for wanting to break Mexican dominance, and that coalition fought a brutal war against Tenochtitlan. The siege of the city in 1521 was not a Spanish operation with indigenous auxiliaries. It was an indigenous operation that Spanish soldiers and weaponry joined. The Tlaxcalans brought the numbers. The Spanish brought steel, firearms, and the psychological disorientation created by horses and artillery, none of which the defenders had encountered in warfare before. But the decisive factor, in terms of sheer death, was something no army controlled. Disease had arrived ahead of the conquistadors' smallpox, to which the peoples of the Americas had no prior exposure, and therefore no developed immunity, had already swept through large parts of the Caribbean. By the time the siege of Tenochtitlan was at its most intense, the city was also fighting an epidemic from within. The death toll from disease during and around the conquest is genuinely staggering, and historians continue to debate the precise numbers, but the scale was catastrophic. Some estimates suggest that central Mexico lost the majority of its population within decades, mostly to successive waves of disease rather than direct violence. The conquest cannot be separated from this biological dimension, and that dimension was not a weapon that anyone deployed deliberately or understood at the time. It was a consequence of contact between populations with radically different immunological histories. The conquest of the Inca Empire a decade later followed a different path, but involved similar elements of opportunism and contingency. Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru in 1532 with a force so small, fewer than 200 men, that the story still seems implausible. What made it possible was timing. The Inca Empire, which stretched along the entire length of West and South America and was the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas, had just emerged from a devastating civil war. Two brothers, Huasca and Atahualpa, had fought for the throne. Atahualpa had won, and the empire was fractured, exhausted, and full of people who had reason to resent whoever had come out on top. Pizarro seized Atahualpa at a meeting in Cajamarca, an act of stunning audacity that threw the empire's command structure into chaos, and then executed him after extracting an enormous ransom in gold and silver. The fall of the Inca state was not predetermined by any superiority of European civilization. It was the product of a dynastic crisis, a catastrophically mistimed encounter, and the rapid exploitation of a system that had lost its center. What followed in both Mexico and the Andes was the construction of colonial structures designed to extract as much wealth as possible from the conquered territories. The primary mechanism was the encomienda, a system in which Spanish colonists were granted authority over a number of indigenous people and could demand labor and tribute from them in exchange for, in theory, protection and Christian instruction. In practice, encomienda was often organized exploitation, with indigenous communities compelled to work under conditions that proved lethal. When silver was discovered in enormous quantities at Potosí in the Andes in 1545, the demand for labor became even more intense, and the meter system, a form of forced labor draft drawn from pre-Inca traditions but drastically intensified under Spanish rule, drove men into mines where the conditions and mercury used in silver processing killed at terrible rates. The silver extracted from Potosí and from Mexican mines like Zacatecas flowed to Spain in quantities that reshaped the global economy, though, as we will see, not always in ways that benefited Spain itself. Colonial rule was not simply about extraction, though extraction was its core. It also involved the systematic suppression of indigenous religious practice the destruction of records and sacred objects, the imposition of Catholic Christianity, and the reorganization of populations into new settlement patterns that broke existing social structures. This was a project of cultural as well as physical transformation, and it was carried out with genuine conviction by many of those doing it. Not only cynical calculation, but indigenous peoples were not passive recipients of any of this. Resistance took many forms: open armed revolt, like the Mixton War in western Mexico in the 1540s, or the Great Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which actually drove the Spanish out of New Mexico for more than a decade. It also took the form of legal challenge, with indigenous leaders using the colonial court systems to defend land rights, resist labor demands, and protect communities. It took the form of cultural negotiation, with indigenous communities adapting Christianity in ways that preserved older meanings beneath Catholic surfaces. And it took the form of survival itself, maintaining language, identity, and social organization under sustained pressure to erase them. The demographic collapse of the 16th century was real and horrific, but it was not total, and the peoples who lived through it found ways to persist that shaped the colonial world in ways that pure top-down accounts of conquest miss entirely. What the conquest created, then, was not a clean replacement of one world by another. It was something more complicated and more violent, an entanglement of peoples, systems, and histories that left almost nothing unchanged on any side. The paper claims made at Tordesillas had been given teeth, but the world those teeth bit into pushed back in ways that would echo for centuries. The violence and disruption of conquest were not the only forces reshaping the world after 1492. Running alongside the politics and the armies and the silver was something quieter, slower, and in the very longest term arguably more transformative than any treaty or battle. Historians call it the Columbian Exchange, the massive, largely unplanned transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and peoples between the eastern and western hemispheres that began the moment the two halves of the world came into sustained contact. No one designed it, no one fully understood it while it was happening, and its effects are still woven into the fabric of daily life in ways most people never think about. The disease dimension was the most immediate and the most devastating, and it is worth sitting with the scale of what happened before moving on to anything else. The peoples of the Americas had lived in biological isolation from Eurasia and Africa for thousands of years. They had their own diseases, their own epidemiological histories, but they had not been exposed to the specific crowd diseases that had evolved in the densely populated, livestock-keeping civilizations of the Old World: smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and others. When those diseases arrived with European ships, the results were catastrophic in ways that are genuinely difficult to comprehend. Smallpox reached the Caribbean islands within years of Columbus's first voyage, and spread from there faster than European explorers themselves. It moved through the Americas along indigenous trade networks, arriving in places where no European had yet set foot. As the previous section touched on, it was already killing people in central Mexico before the siege of Tenochtitlan reached its climax. The demographic estimates scholars have proposed vary widely and remain debated. The populations of the pre-Columbian Americas are genuinely difficult to calculate, and the records of what followed are incomplete and often devastating to read. But the broad consensus points toward population losses across much of the Americas in the 16th century that were staggering by almost any historical standard. Some regions likely lost the majority of their population within 2 or 3 generations. Multiple epidemics arrived in waves, each one hitting communities already weakened by the last. The people dying were not abstractions. They were farmers and priests, weavers and astronomers, mothers and children, the entire social fabric of civilizations that had existed for millennia. It is important to note what this was not. It was not a deliberate biological weapon in the modern sense, at least not in the overwhelming majority of cases. The Europeans of the 16th century did not understand germ theory. They had their own explanations for disease that had nothing to do with microbes. Some of them noticed a pattern that contact brought sickness, but they did not understand the mechanism, and for the most part the epidemics were not engineered. They were a consequence of contact between populations with radically different immunological histories, a biological collision that had no precedent and no remedy available within the knowledge systems of the time. That does not make the outcome any less catastrophic. It simply means the catastrophe was structural rather than fully intentional, which is its own kind of horror. While disease moved from east to west with particular ferocity, the exchange of crops moved in both directions, and the long-term consequences for human populations everywhere were enormous. The Americas contributed to the rest of the world a roster of plants that had simply never existed in Eurasian or African agriculture. Maize, what much of the world calls corn, came from Mesoamerica. The potato came from the Andes. So did tomatoes, chili peppers, cacao, vanilla, squash, sweet potatoes, and tobacco. Peanuts, pineapples, cassava, the list goes on longer than most people realize. What happened when these crops reached the Old World was not immediate or uniform. It took time for farmers to figure out how to grow them, and it took time for skeptical populations to accept unfamiliar foods. But once those barriers were crossed, the impacts on food security and population were profound. The potato in particular changed European history in ways that compound interest makes hard to fully trace. It was calorie-dense, versatile, relatively easy to grow even in poor soils, and could feed a family on a small plot of land. As potato cultivation spread through Ireland, northern Europe, and eventually much of the continent, it contributed to population growth in regions that had previously been limited by what grains could produce. Maize spread through Africa and Asia with similarly significant effects on food production and carrying capacity. Scholars continue to debate how much weight to place on any single factor in population history, but it seems reasonable to say that the crops of the Americas played a meaningful role in enabling population expansion across large parts of the Old World over the 17th through 19th centuries. In the other direction, the Americas received from Europe and Africa crops and animals that transformed their landscapes just as profoundly. Wheat, rice, sugarcane, and coffee all came to the Americas, where sugarcane in particular would have world historical consequences. The brutal plantation economies of the Caribbean and Brazil were built around a crop that the Americas had never seen before contact. But the animal transfers may have been even more visually dramatic in terms of how quickly they changed what the Americas looked, sounded, and functioned like. Horses had actually evolved in the Americas millions of years earlier, but had gone extinct there long before human contact. The animals that Cortés brought to Mexico were, in a sense, returning to a land their ancestors had once roamed, though of course no one knew that at the time. Horses spread from Spanish colonial centers with remarkable speed, and within a relatively short period, indigenous peoples across large portions of the Americas had acquired horses and adapted their cultures around them. On the Great Plains of North America, communities that had been sedentary or semi-nomadic became mounted buffalo hunters, building entire ways of life around the horse that then seemed ancient by the time European Americans encountered them in the 18th and 19th centuries. It is a striking reminder that what looks like timeless tradition often has a specific moment of origin not far back in history. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats also arrived from Europe, and they transformed American ecologies in ways that were not always visible, but proved deeply consequential. Herds of feral cattle and horses spread into regions that had never known large grazing animals, changing vegetation patterns, competing with native wildlife, and altering the soil. These animals also provided new food sources and new economic possibilities for some indigenous communities, even as the broader colonial context in which they arrived was generating dispossession and destruction. What the Columbian Exchange reveals, when you step back and look at it whole, is that the consequences of exploration operated on a scale that went far beyond any individual voyage or conquest. The connection of hemispheres set off biological and ecological processes that ran for centuries, reshaping what people ate, how many of them there were, what their landscapes looked like, and how their bodies interacted with disease. Some of those consequences were catastrophic, particularly for the peoples of the Americas in the early generations of contact. Others reshaped the entire world in ways that cut across the intentions of any explorer, monarch, or conquistador. The Columbian Exchange did not belong to any single nation or empire. It belonged to the fact of connection itself, and connection once made cannot be unmade. While the Columbian Exchange was quietly reshaping the biological fabric of the world, something more deliberately dramatic was also underway, a voyage so ambitious that the people who planned it could not have fully imagined what they were committing to. By the second decade of the 16th century, the basic outlines of the Americas were becoming clearer to European mapmakers, and with that clarity came an uncomfortable realization. The landmass sitting between Europe and Asia was not a detour around a narrow sea. It was a continent, possibly two, and it was blocking the western route to the Spice Islands that Columbus had originally set out to find. The question driving Spanish ambitions was whether you could go around it, and if so, how far around and at what cost. The man who proposed to answer that question was Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese mariner who had sailed to Asia via the eastern route and believed with a conviction that bordered on obsession that a passage existed somewhere at the southern end of the American landmass that would allow a ship to break through into the ocean beyond. He had no proof. He had rumour, inference, and a geographical instinct sharpened by years at sea. When Portugal declined to fund the expedition, he took his proposal to Spain, and in 1519 he departed from Seville with 5 ships and roughly 270 men, a mixed company of Spanish and Portuguese sailors, adventurers, convicts, and officers who were already, before they had even left European waters, in a state of uneasy tension with their commander. The crossing of the Atlantic and the journey down the South American coast were hard enough. The expedition wintered in Patagonia, where cold, boredom, and deteriorating relations between Magellan and several of his Spanish captains produced a mutiny that he suppressed with a ruthlessness that made clear he had no intention of turning back. One ship was wrecked, another turned around and sailed back to Spain. But in October 1520, more than a year after leaving Seville, the remaining vessels found what they were looking for, a winding, treacherous passage through the southern tip of the continent, a labyrinth of grey water and sharp rock and unpredictable winds that took 38 days to navigate, and that Magellan named the Strait of All Saints, though history would ultimately give it his own name. What he found on the other side was something none of the Europeans aboard had any framework to comprehend. They had known, in the abstract, that a large ocean lay beyond the Americas. What they had not known was its size, the Pacific, as Magellan named it, Pacific meaning peaceful, a description that seemed accurate in those first relatively calm weeks, and would later seem almost bitterly ironic, is larger than all the land on Earth combined. Crossing it on 16th century rations, with no reliable charts, no knowledge of where the winds would take them, and no certainty that there was anything on the other side worth reaching, was an experience that pushed the men to the edge of survival and in many cases beyond it. The Pacific crossing lasted nearly 4 months. They found almost nothing, a few small, uninhabited islands that offered no meaningful resupply. The food ran out, then the water ran low, then the scurvy arrived. The men ate leather stripped from the rigging. They ate sawdust mixed with whatever they could find. Rats became a luxury. By the time they reached the Mariana Islands and later the Philippines in early 1521, they had lost men to starvation and disease, and the survivors were in no condition for what came next. Magellan did not complete the voyage he had started. In April 1521, he became entangled in a local political conflict in the Philippines, an alliance with one ruler that led him to participate in a raid against a rival chieftain on the island of Mactan. The battle went badly. The Spanish weapons that had overwhelmed indigenous American armies failed to deliver the same decisive advantage in a shallow water fight against well-prepared defenders. Magellan was killed, struck with spears and arrows by warriors fighting for a man named Lapu-Lapu, who has been celebrated in the Philippines ever since as the first to resist European aggression on those shores. The commander, who had been the vision and the will of the entire expedition, died on a beach far from home, and the voyage still had to find its way back. What happened next fell to Juan Sebastian Elcano, one of the Spanish captains who had actually been involved in the earlier mutiny against Magellan. With the expedition's numbers so reduced that they could no longer crew 3 ships, they burned one vessel and continued with 2. One of those ships eventually had to turn back, unable to beat against the winds, and ultimately captured by the Portuguese. Elcano, commanding the Victoria, already the smallest ship in the original fleet, pressed westward through waters controlled by Portugal, slipping past patrols with a mixture of luck and determination, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and on September 6, 1522, limped into the harbour at Sanlúcar de Barrameda with 18 survivors. They had been gone nearly 3 years. They were skeletal, and they had done something no human beings had ever done before. They had sailed continuously in one direction and arrived back where they started. The implications took time to sink in, but they were profound. The voyage confirmed beyond any reasonable argument that the Earth was a globe and that it could be circumnavigated by sea. It revealed that the Pacific Ocean was so vast that earlier calculations of the world's size had been dramatically wrong. Even the relatively accurate estimates had not captured how much of the planet was covered by that single ocean. Old maps, already strained by everything that had been discovered since 1492, now had to be rethought at their most fundamental level. The world was not the size people had imagined. It was larger, more water than land, and the distances that separated its various parts were genuinely daunting. But the voyage also pointed towards something beyond geography. It demonstrated that a ship could, in principle, reach any part of the world's oceans from any other part, given enough time, enough provisions, and enough determination. The question was no longer whether global maritime connection was possible. It was who would build it, and on whose terms. The Portuguese had their eastern routes. The Spanish had their western ones. The Americas were being drawn into a system of colonial extraction. The Pacific, which had just been revealed in its true and enormous scale, was already beginning to look like the next arena of competition. The first circumnavigation was not a triumph of harmony. It was bought at tremendous human cost, and it had been motivated by the same commercial appetites that were reshaping the rest of the world. But it marked a threshold. Before Magellan and Elcano, the world was a collection of regions with edges beyond which knowledge ran out. After them, the outline of the whole was, at least in rough form, known. The age of exploration had not just found new places. It had found the shape of the place where all of them existed together. The shape of the world had been revealed, but knowing its outline was not the same as controlling it. What followed the first decades of exploration was something more calculated and more durable, the construction of empires designed not just to claim territory, but to extract wealth from it on a continuous organized basis. The age of discovery was giving way to the age of exploitation, and the mechanisms built during this period would define global economics for centuries. Spain's empire in the Americas was, at its core, an empire of silver. The conquests of Mexico and Peru had delivered something far more valuable than spices. They had delivered access to the largest silver deposits in the known world. The mines at Potosí, discovered in 1545, in what is now Bolivia, became perhaps the most productive single source of silver in human history. At its height, Potosí was one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere. A brutal, high-altitude city built around the mountain, the Spanish called Cerro Rico, the rich hill, where indigenous workers and enslaved Africans laboured under conditions that killed them in vast numbers. Estimates of the deaths at Potosí and in the broader silver economy remain a subject of historical debate, but the scale of human suffering was immense by any reasonable accounting. The silver extracted from these mines did not simply accumulate in Spanish royal vaults. It moved the Spanish crown, organized its Atlantic trade through a convoy system, the floater, that linked American ports to Seville through tightly regulated annual fleets, designed to protect the treasure from pirates and rival powers. twice a year, roughly. These fleets crossed the Atlantic, loaded with silver, dyes, and colonial goods heading east, and European manufactured products, mercury for ore processing, and settlers heading west. This system made Seville enormously wealthy and turned the Spanish Atlantic into something like a managed pipeline, a mercantilist architecture of remarkable ambition, if one riddled with corruption, delay, and vulnerability to storms. The Portuguese built their empire on a different logic. Rather than seizing entire continents, Portugal aimed at choke points, the narrow straits, key ports, and critical trading posts that controlled the flow of goods across the Indian Ocean world. From their fortified positions at Ceuta in North Africa to Goa on the Indian coast, Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, Malacca at the hinge between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, and eventually Macau on the Chinese coast, the Portuguese constructed what historians sometimes describe as a seaborne empire of commerce, a network of nodes rather than a territorial mass. They forced Asian merchants to purchase passes, allowing them to trade in Portuguese-controlled waters, extracting a toll on a commerce that had existed for centuries before any Portuguese ship arrived. This model had real limits. The Portuguese were never numerous enough to truly dominate Indian Ocean trade, and indigenous merchants, Arab, Indian, Malay, Chinese, found ways around Portuguese controls or simply endured them until circumstances changed. But for much of the 16th century, Portugal's Estado da India, its official name for the Indian Ocean enterprise, was extracting pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and silk at a scale that made Lisbon one of the wealthiest cities in Europe and completely transformed the spice trade that had previously flowed overland through Ottoman and Venetian hands. The most extraordinary intersection of these two empires happened in the Philippines, specifically in Manila, which Spain founded in 1571. Manila became the hinge of something genuinely new in world economic history, a direct, sustained trade route connecting the Americas to Asia. Chinese merchants brought silk, porcelain, and luxury goods to Manila in their junks. Spanish galleons carried those goods across the Pacific to Acapulco on the Mexican coast, where they entered the overland trade routes to the Atlantic and ultimately to Spain and the rest of Europe. The payment flowing back across the Pacific to China was American silver, and the volumes were staggering. Chinese demand for silver was enormous. The Ming dynasty had made silver the basis of its tax system, and the Manila galleon trade fed that demand for over 2 centuries. American silver, mined by coerced indigenous and African labor in the Andes, was being absorbed into the Chinese economy through a trading network that stretched across the world's largest ocean. This was, arguably, the first genuinely global supply chain. The effects were felt far beyond any single market. The flood of American silver into European and then Asian economies contributed to significant inflation across much of the 16th century, a phenomenon economists and historians have labeled the price revolution. Wages lagged, costs rose, and the social fabric of many European communities strained under pressures that would have seemed inexplicable without understanding the flow of New World metals through the global monetary system. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic itself, a different economic structure was taking shape. The plantation, a large-scale agricultural enterprise worked by coerced or enslaved labor, emerged first in the Portuguese Atlantic island colonies like Madeira and São Tomé, before being transplanted to Brazil and then across the Caribbean. Sugar was the initial engine. Cultivating and processing sugar was extraordinarily labor-intensive, and the demand for it in European markets was insatiable. The solution the colonial powers converged on, drawing on precedents that were already forming in the Atlantic island experiments, was the mass importation of enslaved Africans. The plantation economy and the transatlantic slave trade became structurally inseparable, and that fusion would shape the entire Atlantic world for centuries. What had begun as trading posts and exploratory voyages was solidifying into something systematic and self-perpetuating. It is worth pausing on this transition because it represents something important about how exploration and empire relate to each other. The explorers who set out in search of routes and knowledge generated information. But the information once generated was captured by institutions, royal courts, merchant houses, religious orders, colonial bureaucracies that bent it toward the extraction of wealth. The individual daring of navigators became the administered machinery of empire. The wonder of reaching a previously unknown coastline became the surveyor's calculation of how much silver could be moved through it, how many enslaved people could be worked on it, how many ships could safely cross to it. By the late 16th century, the empires of exploration had become something more recognizable and more troubling. Persistent colonial systems with their own laws, their own labor regimes, their own circuits of commerce and violence. They were not static. They would be challenged, reshaped, and in many places overturned. But the foundations laid during this period, the Atlantic slave trade, the silver economy, the Indian Ocean trading empire, the Manila galleon, were foundations that would prove deeply resistant to dismantling. The age of exploration had not just opened the world, it had begun reorganizing it along lines that would take centuries to fully understand, and are still, in many respects, with us. By the close of the 16th century, Spain and Portugal had constructed what looked, on paper at least, like a duopoly over the world's oceans. The Treaty of Tordesillas had divided the globe between them. Their fleets were the largest, their colonial infrastructures the most developed, their cartographic knowledge the most extensive. But empires built on legal agreements and papal decrees are only as durable as the military and economic power backing them. And by the 1580s and 1590s, that power was beginning to show cracks. Into those cracks, the Dutch, the English, and the French inserted themselves with remarkable speed and, eventually, remarkable effect. The challenge these three powers posed to Iberian dominance was not simply a matter of envy or opportunism, though there was plenty of both. It emerged from specific historical circumstances. The Dutch were fighting a decades-long war of independence against Spanish rule, and raiding Spanish commerce was as much a military strategy as a commercial one. The English, freshly Protestant and nervous about Spanish power in the Atlantic following various diplomatic ruptures, found that antagonizing Spain's empire was both profitable and strategically useful. The French, caught between their own religious wars and the ambitions of a Spanish-aligned Habsburg dynasty, had been probing the Atlantic since the early 16th century, quietly establishing footholds that the Iberian powers found deeply inconvenient. None of these three nations accepted the Tordesillas arrangement as binding. As the French king Francis I reportedly demanded, only half-joking, to see the clause in Adam's will that excluded France from its share of the world. The instrument these powers developed to challenge Iberian dominance was not at first the nation-state itself, but something more focused and in some ways more ruthless: the Chartered Trading Company. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602 and known by its Dutch initials as the VOC, was among the most consequential commercial organizations in history. It was granted a monopoly by the Dutch government on trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan, effectively the entire Indian and Pacific Ocean world. More remarkably, it was given powers that normally belonged to states: the authority to negotiate treaties, maintain armies, construct forts, and wage war. The English East India Company, founded just 2 years earlier in 1600, operated on a similar model, pooling investor capital under royal charter to pursue trade in Asia. These were not simple merchant ventures. They were in effect sovereign commercial enterprises, a form of organized capitalism that blurred the line between commerce and conquest in ways that would have enormous consequences. The VOC moved aggressively. Dutch fleets attacked Portuguese positions across the Indian Ocean, seizing Malacca in 1641 and establishing control over the spice-producing islands of what is now Indonesia, particularly the Banda Islands, where nutmeg grew. The story of the Banda Islands is a particularly stark illustration of how commercial rivalry could shade into atrocity. The Dutch Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen oversaw a campaign in 1621 that effectively destroyed the indigenous Bandanese population, replacing them with Dutch-run plantations worked by enslaved people to produce the nutmeg the VOC intended to monopolize. The English East India Company pursued a more cautious early strategy, establishing trading posts on the Indian subcontinent at Surat and later at Madras, Bombay and Calcutta, negotiating access to trade through the Mughal Empire rather than immediately seeking military dominance. The differences in approach reflected resources and circumstances, but both companies understood that sustained commercial power in Asia required permanent, fortified presence, not just the occasional voyage. In the Atlantic, the methods of challenge were different but equally calculated. Privateering, essentially licensed piracy, in which privately owned ships were authorized by their governments to attack enemy commerce in exchange for a share of the prizes, became a major instrument of English and French competition with Spain. Figures like Francis Drake were celebrated at home as heroes and condemned in Madrid as pirates, which is perhaps a sign that they were somewhat both. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1457 and 1580 was, among other things, a highly profitable raiding expedition along the Pacific coasts of Spanish America, striking at the empire where it had assumed itself safe. The line between exploration, trade, and warfare at sea was genuinely thin during this period, and many of the same men crossed it repeatedly. Colonization followed, though often after considerable false starts. The French established early and largely unsuccessful settlements in Brazil and Florida before finding more durable footholds in Canada. Champlain founded Quebec in 1608, and eventually in the Caribbean and the Mississippi Valley. The English tried and failed at Roanoke in the 1580s before the survival of Jamestown in 1607 opened the door to sustained settlement along the North American coast. Dutch colonists established New Amsterdam at the tip of Manhattan and planted settlements in what would become New York and New Jersey, as well as in South Africa at the Cape of Good Hope, a provisioning station that would grow into something far larger and more consequential. These were settler colonies in a meaningfully different sense from the Portuguese trading post model. They involved the movement of substantial European populations, the displacement or destruction of indigenous peoples, and the construction of new societies with their own agricultural and eventually industrial economies. All three powers also expended considerable energy searching for northern passages to Asia, routes that might allow them to bypass Iberian-controlled southern seas entirely. The English sent expeditions into the frozen waters of the Arctic in search of a northwest passage through North America and a northeast passage along the Russian coast. Henry Hudson, sailing variously for the Dutch and the English, explored what are now Hudson Bay and the Hudson River. These expeditions rarely found what they were looking for, and the northern routes proved largely impractical for regular commerce, given the technology of the time. But they generated geographic knowledge, established legal claims, and opened contact with indigenous peoples across northern North America, in ways that shaped the fur trade and the long history of those regions. What all of this reveals is something important about the trajectory of the Age of Exploration itself. It had begun as a set of specific, sponsored voyages aimed at reaching known or imagined destinations, a way around Africa, a route west to Asia, a passage through unknown waters. It had then become an instrument of empire, used to build the extraction systems described in the previous chapter. By the early 17th century, it had transformed into something else again. Sustained, institutionalized geopolitical rivalry between multiple European powers, each using exploration's tools, ships, maps, trade routes, colonial settlements, as weapons in a competition that was as much about relative power in Europe as it was about the territories being contested overseas. The world had not merely been discovered, it had become a theatre for conflicts that were, in a real sense, just beginning. The story just told of chartered companies, rival empires, and competing European powers carving the world into commercial theatres has a dimension that the ledgers and logbooks of those enterprises rarely capture honestly. Behind every sugar shipment, every tobacco hogshead, Every nutmeg cargo lay a system of coercion so vast and so violent that it must be understood not as a side effect of the age of exploration, but as one of its central engines. Slavery was not an invention of the Atlantic world. It had existed across Africa, Asia, and Europe for centuries before any Portuguese ship rounded Cape Bojador. But what emerged in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries was something qualitatively different, a transatlantic system of forced migration operating at an industrial scale, organized by states and commercial interests, and tied directly to the plantation economies that European colonization had created in the Americas and the Caribbean. The connection between exploration and slavery was not incidental. It was structural. It began, as so much else did, with sugar. The Portuguese had been growing sugar on Atlantic island colonies, Madeira, the Azores, São Tomé, using enslaved African labour before Columbus ever crossed the ocean. When that same plantation model was transplanted to Brazil and then to the Caribbean islands, seized by European powers through the 17th century, the demand for labour expanded enormously. The indigenous populations of those regions had been devastated by disease, violence, and displacement, to the point where they could not fill the labour requirements that European landowners and commercial backers were demanding. The transatlantic slave trade emerged as the answer European colonizers chose to that question. The scale of what followed is difficult to fully absorb. Conservative scholarly estimates suggest that somewhere between 12 and 12.5 million people were forcibly transported across the Atlantic between the mid-15th century and the 19th century. The majority of voyages and the majority of people transported came after the period conventionally called the Age of Exploration. The trade intensified through the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th centuries. But its foundations were laid precisely during the period this script has been tracing. The Portuguese established the earliest sustained slave trading networks along the West African coast. The Spanish used enslaved labour in their American mines and Caribbean plantations from the earliest decades of colonization. By the time the Dutch, English, and French were competing for Caribbean islands in the 1600s, the plantation slavery complex was already the dominant economic model for colonial wealth in the Atlantic world. What drove it was demand: tobacco in Virginia, sugar in Barbados and Saint Domingue, rice in Carolina, coffee and indigo across the Caribbean. Each of these plantation crops required enormous amounts of intensive, year-round labour under conditions that were brutal by any measure. The economies of entire European nations and eventually of European settler colonies in North America became entangled with this system. Merchants in Bristol, Amsterdam, and Nantes grew wealthy financing slave voyages. Insurers underwriting those voyages created financial instruments that persisted in European commercial law for generations. The connections ran deep and they ran wide. But those 12 million people were not passive cargo. They were human beings with histories, languages, relationships, and, when the possibility existed, determined resistance. The Middle Passage, that catastrophic ocean crossing in conditions of extreme overcrowding, deliberate dehumanization, and chronic violence, killed an estimated 15 to 20% of those who boarded the ships, possibly more in the earlier period when the trade was less systematized. Those who survived arrived in unknown lands, stripped of most material possessions, separated from family and community, subjected to a legal and social system designed to deny their humanity. The wonder is not that resistance existed. It is that the systems of control required to suppress it were so elaborate and so continuously reinforced, which itself tells you something about how persistent that resistance was. Enslaved people resisted in ways both dramatic and quiet. Large-scale revolts punctuated the history of every slave society in the Americas. The Haitian Revolution of the 1790s, the only successful large-scale slave revolt in history that resulted in an independent nation, did not come from nowhere. It was the culmination of a culture of resistance that had been building in Saint Domingue for generations. Earlier revolts in Barbados, Jamaica, Suriname, and Brazil demonstrated the same pattern. that wherever slavery existed, so did organized efforts to end it by force. The authorities who crushed these revolts did so with deliberate brutality, understanding that the psychological as well as physical stakes required overwhelming response. Less dramatic but equally significant were the Maroon communities, groups of escaped enslaved people who established free settlements in the interior of colonies across the Americas. In Brazil, the Quilombo of Palmares survived for nearly a century, at its height sheltering perhaps 20,000 people and repelling repeated colonial military expeditions. Maroon communities in Jamaica negotiated formal treaties with British colonial authorities in the 1730s that recognized their freedom and autonomy in exchange for agreements to return newly escaped enslaved people, a compromise that illustrates the complicated moral terrain of survival under impossible circumstances. In Suriname, Guyana, and across the Caribbean, Maroon communities persisted, and in some cases persist to this day, representing living continuities with that long resistance. And then there was the resistance that does not always make it into heroic narratives, the daily acts of defiance, subversion, and survival that enslaved people maintained within the system. Work slowdowns, feigned illness, the preservation of religious practices, musical traditions, and linguistic elements that colonial authorities tried to eradicate. The cultivation of small garden plots as economic and psychological space. The maintenance of family bonds across plantation boundaries in defiance of a legal system that did not recognize those bonds as real. These were not small things. They were the mechanisms by which cultures survived and identities persisted across the most determined efforts at erasure in modern history. The indigenous peoples of the Americas faced a different but equally catastrophic set of consequences. The demographic collapse caused by epidemic disease, to which indigenous populations had no prior immunity, was, by most scholarly estimates, among the largest mortality events in human history. Population losses of 50, 70, even 90% have been estimated for some regions within a century of European contact, though the precise figures remain subjects of significant scholarly debate. Disease did not operate in isolation from violence. Forced labor, displacement, and the destruction of agricultural and social systems. These factors compounded each other in ways that make it genuinely difficult to separate their individual effects. What is not in dispute is the scale of the outcome. The cultures, languages, and knowledge systems lost in that collapse represent an incalculable reduction in human diversity. And yet indigenous resistance also persisted in armed conflict, in legal contestation, in the preservation of language and ceremony under conditions designed to eliminate both, and in the survival of communities that continue to assert their presence and rights today. All of this is inseparable from the history of exploration and empire being traced throughout this script. The ships and the maps and the navigational innovations were real achievements, but they were achievements placed in the service of systems whose costs were borne overwhelmingly by people who had no say in any of it. Any honest accounting of what this age produced has to hold both of those realities at the same time. So what did this age actually make? After tracing the ships and the routes, the conquests and the exchanges, the trade empires and the systems of coercion that sustained them, it is worth pausing to ask what, in the broadest sense, the age of exploration produced. Not just in terms of who won and who lost, though that accounting matters enormously, but in terms of what kind of world it built, and whether that world is recognizably the one we still inhabit. Start with something that can be measured: geography. Before the 15th century, the world's landmasses were known to each other only in fragments. Medieval European maps placed Jerusalem at the center of the world and placed monsters at the edges. Chinese maps were sophisticated but regional. Arab cartographers had produced remarkably accurate maps of the Indian Ocean world, but the Americas were entirely absent from every tradition because no connected knowledge of them existed outside the Americas themselves. Within roughly a century of Columbus's first voyage, European cartographers had produced maps that were, for the first time in history, recognizably global. They were imprecise by modern standards, Coastlines were rough, interiors were largely guesswork, distances frequently wrong, but the basic structure of the world's continents and oceans was, for the first time, sketched onto a single surface. That was genuinely new. Ptolemy's coordinates had shaped European geographical imagination for over 1,000 years. The voyages of exploration shattered that inheritance and replaced it with something empirically derived from actual navigation. The world had to be redrawn, and the act of redrawing it changed how people thought about where they were and what kind of place they lived in. Science moved with the maps. Naturalists aboard European ships and stationed in colonial territories collected, classified, and sent back specimens of plants, animals, and geological formations that European science had never encountered. The sheer volume of new data forced the development of better systems for organizing biological knowledge work that would eventually lead to the formal taxonomy that Linnaeus would systematize in the 18th century. Astronomical observation improved as navigators at sea needed better star charts, and as the necessity of determining longitude drove sustained investment in precision timekeeping. The practical demands of exploration and empire fed back into theoretical science in ways that are difficult to fully untangle but clearly significant. The scale of what was unknown, once confronted directly, seems to have had a productive destabilizing effect on European intellectual confidence, a willingness to question received authority that historians have connected, sometimes controversially, to the broader intellectual upheaval of the scientific revolution. Then there is the economy. What the age of exploration produced gradually and then with accelerating momentum was the first genuinely global economic system. The Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Ocean trading worlds, which had previously operated as distinct if loosely connected circuits, were knitted together into a single system in which goods, people, and capital moved across all three. Silver from Potosi travelled to Manila to purchase Chinese silk and porcelain. African enslaved people produced sugar in Brazil that was refined in Amsterdam and consumed across Europe. Indian cotton textiles were traded for enslaved people on the West African coast. Spices from the Banda Islands moved through Dutch warehouses in Batavia before reaching European dinner tables. No single person planned this system. It emerged from thousands of individual commercial decisions made by merchants, company directors, colonial administrators, and producers across the globe, all operating within frameworks of violence and coercion that were themselves products of the age. But once assembled, this interconnected economy had a logic of its own that persisted and deepened regardless of which European power happened to be dominant at any given moment. That interconnection is the foundation upon which modern global trade rests. The specific routes have changed, the power relationships have shifted, dramatically in some cases. But the basic architecture of a world in which raw materials, manufactured goods and labour flow across oceanic distances, according to price signals and commercial incentives, is recognisably descended from what the age of exploration assembled. Where exactly this age ends is genuinely contested. Some historians draw the line at roughly 1600, when the major oceanic routes had been established, and the Portuguese and Spanish monopolies were beginning to crack. Others extend it to 1750 or beyond, arguing that the era of exploration shades continuously into the era of formal empire without a meaningful break. There is something to be said for this latter view. The plantation systems, the slave trade, the chartered companies, and the settler colonies that defined the 17th and 18th centuries were not separate from the age of exploration. They were its consequences, operating at greater scale. Calling 1492 or 1522 the end of one era and the beginning of another risks making the transition seem cleaner and more deliberate than it actually was. What we might reasonably say is that the age of exploration created the conditions for imperial modernity, and that those conditions were then inhabited and exploited in ways that extended far beyond what any individual explorer or monarch could have foreseen. Which brings the question of what to call it. Discovery implies a perspective, specifically a European one, that erases the billions of people who already knew these lands existed because they had always lived there. Expansion is more honest, but perhaps too neutral, too bloodless for what actually happened. Collision captures the violence and the rupture without accounting for the genuine exchanges, biological, cultural, intellectual, that also resulted. Connection acknowledges the integration without reckoning with what that integration cost and who paid for it. Perhaps it needs to be all of those things simultaneously, held in tension rather than resolved. This age produced genuine advances in human knowledge of the world and in the material scope of what human societies could organize and sustain. It also produced catastrophes of a scale and duration that continued to shape human life for centuries, and in some of their consequences still do. Both of those things are true. The difficulty is holding them together rather than letting one crowd out the other. The trade networks established during this era are the ancestors of modern global supply chains. The migrations, forced and free, that it set in motion produced the demographic composition of the modern Americas, of much of the Caribbean, of port cities across Africa and Asia. The inequalities it generated between regions and peoples fed into patterns of wealth and poverty that remain visible in economic statistics today. The cultural exchanges it enabled produced hybrid traditions in music, cuisine, language, and religion that are now simply woven into what those cultures are. This age did not create the modern world alone, but it is very difficult to understand the modern world without it. 5 centuries have passed since the first European ships crossed the Atlantic, and yet the world those voyages set in motion is still, in very meaningful ways, the world we live in today. Think about something as simple as what you had for breakfast this morning. If there was coffee, sugar, or chocolate involved, you were participating in trade networks and agricultural systems that trace directly back to the age of exploration. If there was wheat bread alongside fruit that came from a different continent, or if you seasoned anything with spices, the same is true. The Columbian Exchange did not end when the ships stopped being a novelty. It became the background of ordinary life so thoroughly that we stopped noticing it was there. Language works the same way. Hundreds of millions of people across the Americas, Africa, and Asia speak Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch as first or primary languages, not because those languages were inherently superior or more expressive, but because the power structures of the age of exploration imposed them, sometimes with enormous violence across territories where other languages had flourished for millennia. And yet those colonial languages absorbed and transformed in their new environments too. Brazilian Portuguese sounds and feels different from its Iberian origin. Caribbean English carries the rhythms of African and indigenous language families woven into its structure. Latin American Spanish is dotted with Nahuatl, Quechua, and Arawak words that were absorbed centuries ago and have never left. The legacy of the age is not pure European imposition, but something more complicated and more interesting, a set of collisions that produced new cultural forms that now belong entirely to the peoples who speak and live them. The borders of the modern world carry the same fingerprints. Many of the national boundaries across Africa, Asia, and the Americas were drawn not by the peoples who lived there, but by European powers negotiating with each other, sometimes in treaties signed an ocean away, sometimes at conference tables where no one from the affected regions was present. The lines that divide nations today still reflect, in many cases, the logic of colonial partition rather than the logic of shared language, culture, or identity. That is why some borders seem arbitrary, because at the moment of their creation they were. Their consequences, however, have been anything but. And then there is the inequality. The patterns of wealth and poverty that run through the contemporary world, between regions, between nations, between populations, within nations, did not emerge from nowhere. They were shaped in decisive ways by who extracted value from whom during the centuries following the great voyages. The plantation economy, the silver trade, the chartered company systems that moved wealth from periphery to center. These were not neutral arrangements that everyone entered freely. They were systems of coercion that transferred enormous resources from colonized peoples and territories to European hands. That transfer had compounding effects over generations. It funded industrialization in some places while depleting the foundations for it in others. Economists and historians continue to debate the precise mechanisms and the degree to which those historical structures explain present-day disparities, but very few serious scholars would argue that they are irrelevant to it. What is perhaps most important to carry away from this entire story, though, is something that the word exploration has always risked obscuring. This was not one story. It was not a single human adventure narrated from a single perspective. It was dozens, hundreds, thousands of overlapping human stories happening simultaneously, intersecting violently and sometimes productively, and generating consequences that their participants could neither foresee nor fully control. There is the story of the Portuguese pilot navigating an unfamiliar coastline with instruments he only partly trusted. But there is also the story of the West African king weighing the military advantages of access to European firearms against the catastrophic long-term cost of participating in the slave trade. There is the story of the Aztec interpreter who served as a bridge between two worlds and whose choices shaped events that neither world fully understood. There is the story of the enslaved woman on a Barbadian sugar plantation who preserved a medical tradition from her home region that was eventually absorbed into what we now call modern pharmacology. There is the story of the Malay merchant in Malacca who had built a cosmopolitan trading life before the Portuguese arrived, and who had to decide suddenly how to survive in a world that was being forcibly reorganized around him. The Age of Exploration is often taught as a story about Europeans going out into the world, but it is just as accurately a story about what the rest of the world experienced, negotiated, resisted, and ultimately remade as the terms of engagement were imposed upon them. Both of those stories are true, and understanding the age fully means making space for all of them. So here's the question worth sitting with. Of everything this era set in motion, the trade systems, the biological exchanges, the forced migrations, the cultural fusions, the inequalities, the new sciences, the remade borders, which consequence feels most significant to you today? Which thread, when you pull it, seems most connected to the world as you actually live in it? We would genuinely love to know what you think. Leave your answer in the comments, and while you are there, if this series has been worth your time, please give the video a like and subscribe so you do not miss what we cover next. Share the video with anyone you think would enjoy it, and tell us where in the world you are watching or listening from. This story belongs to all of us, and it is always better explored together.